Greetings, everyone. Dear panelists, dear our great C20 members who are joining us today for this exciting session. My name is Osama Al-Hanaki. I am the C20 co-Sherpa this year. I also work with my colleague Stefano Prato from the Society of International Development in co-chairing the IFA working group of the C20. It is my honor to be moderating this session today, and I look forward for an engaging and rich discussion. I would like to invite the audience to feel free to post any questions or comments in the chat section next to the live stream that you see in the C20 platform. We will be able, hopefully, to look into your questions and discuss them at the Q&A section later on this session. Let me start with some framing remarks to introduce our topic today. Tax might seem like a boring policy and technical discussion for some people. Some people don't find it interesting to engage with, but in reality, tax is a key enabler for sustainable development. Taxation is not only a fiscal policy, it's a social policy with a direct link to inequality. Taxation is not only a fiscal policy, it's also a development policy affecting public spending on health and education. It could also be considered a foreign policy, affecting how countries compete or cooperate to share taxing rights and combat tax evasion. That's why at the C20, civil society has always centralized tax policy advocacy, because we need tax policymakers and negotiators to remember its deep impacts on human lives. Tax systems must empower people. They must be designed progressively. They must not exacerbate inequalities. They also must help bridge the financing gap for public spending on health, education, social protection, and all the ambitious shared global goals. Over the years, the C20 has recognized the G20's commitment in addressing the taxation of the digital economy, to working for a globally fair and modern international tax system and supporting developing countries in building their tax capacity. The G20 is even considering defensive measures against jurisdictions that do not comply with international standards of tax transparency. However, the matter of the fact is that our international tax system is not fit for the 21st century. This is an assessment shared by both the G20, the C20, and international organizations. We all agree that a reform is needed to stop a race to the bottom, to adapt to tax systems to the challenges arising from the digital economy. We all agree that we must help developing countries and support them with fair tax allocation of taxing rights and fiscal space. Let me start today with our esteemed panelist, Mr. Pascal Sammo, the director of the Center for Tax and Policy at the OECD, to kindly provide an overview on the updates and progress made for global tax reform negotiations at this moment. Pascal, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Osama, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to the audience. Extremely happy to be with you, and thanks for taking the initiative of this panel. I think you've said it all in your few words of introduction, so we may save the whole panel, because I would think that there is indeed consensus among the observers that the current international tax system is not fit for the challenges of the 21st century. And you've pointed to a few markers of what is not fixed. The balance between developed and developing countries in the tax field, in international tax, is probably not yet the right balance. There is still a pretty harsh tax competition, and I think everybody would recognize that it's time to stop it. It's time to put an end to it. There may be disagreement on what the right level of minimum tax would be, but the idea that tax competition per se is a good thing and only a good thing is no longer the consensus. And you've mentioned one of the key words, which may have maybe taken too much the public eye, but it's still very important. It's the challenges of the digitalization of the economy that we are facing. So we all agree that something needs to be done. We may not agree on the extent of what needs to be done. We may not agree on how we should get things done. We may not agree on who should do things. But what I think we should all agree is that the G20 has been a place which has helped change the dynamic of international tax. So maybe before coming to the conclusion, which will be what is going to happen virtually in Riyadh in a few days on Wednesday, where there will be a tax package presented to the finance ministers and then to the G20 leaders later in November. I would just like to sketch out some quick history of the international tax system to see where we come from, and to see that even if we have not yet finished the journey towards changing international tax, I think we have started something extremely significant in terms of changes. So let me start with the fundamentals. As you say, tax was considered for a long time as boring. I think now a number of people, if you go on tax Twitter, for instance, you will see that there is nothing boring on tax Twitter. You have people passionate about it, writing a lot of stuff, and having many different ideas, very stimulating. But the fundamental is that at the origin, tax was, or international tax for sure, was pretty boring within one paradigm, which was established in the early 20th century. 1928 could be the date we would have in mind. It's where the League of Nations, a limited number of countries independent at that time, which came up with rules. And the rules came from the fact that a number of countries during the First World War introduced direct taxation, which created double taxation. And therefore, the response to that was a model tax convention. We today have 3,500 bilateral tax treaties, but that's the matrix, that's the origin of international tax, extremely limited. I think that what we can take from that long period of time, almost 1 century, where this has been the main paradigm, and the only thing that tax people were playing with was within that box, within that frame of tax treaties. The main elements were elimination of double taxation on a bilateral basis, without much cooperation, and sometimes hardly any cooperation, except for the implementation of tax treaties being pretty weak instruments to the extent that they don't create taxing rights, they just limit the taxing right of countries. And finally, you can see the concept of sovereignty being at the core of tax treaties, little cooperation provided for, no obligation to find ways of solving disputes. Countries can endeavor to solve disputes, but they are not obliged to solve disputes. And overall, a pretty limited footprint on domestic system. And the system, which again was based on the bilateral relationship, has lasted for almost 1 century. There was a first attempt in the 90s to change it because a number of countries, starting with the US, said, well, we're losing corporate income tax revenue, we need to do something. But this didn't really, was not really successful, let's say. It was the work of the OECD on harmful tax practices. It was not very inclusive. It was marginal. And at the end of the day, not much change was introduced. Instead, we have seen a massive shift in the paradigm of international tax 12 years ago with the global financial crisis. With the global financial crisis, the world woke up, politicians woke up, and they woke up because of the level of inequalities, because of the pretty good work that campaigners had done to show that tax was an important matter and that tax fairness was so important. They woke up and say, we need to stop tax havens, to make it short. And these, to do this, they empowered the OECD to come up with standards, with legal instruments, with new institutions, with new fora to be able to move this forward. Where are we today? I think we are in the middle of this change. The first element has been to increase transparency. As I indicated, you had no cooperation. Now you have cooperation. You have no longer bank secrecy. It's over. 84 million bank accounts exchanged last September for a total value of 10 trillion euros. It's done. We need to go further. We need to make sure that all developing countries have access to automatic exchange of information, but it is happening and nothing will stop that. But not only do we have that, but we have multilateral instruments, a multilateral convention on mutual assistance with 144 countries having signed it. We have more than 8,000 bilateral relationships derived from this instrument. And also a body, which is the Global Forum on Transparency, with 161 members, making sure that this is implemented with automatic exchange of information. The second phase in that change of paradigm has been to tackle or to start tackling the tax avoidance of multinational companies, aggressive tax planning, base erosion, and profit shifting. And here again, we have a multilateral instrument, we have a number of standards, and we have a body which is the inclusive framework. And the third phase, which is what we are doing currently, is trying to address the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy with two pillars. One pillar, which is about creating a new nexus, recognizing that having a permanent establishment, a fixed base of business in a country should no longer be the only criteria for a foreign company to be taxable in the country, and have new profit allocation rules to move away from the arm's length principle, which obliges companies to price internal transactions. That should be a burden on them. Actually, it's an opportunity to do tax planning aggressively. And the other part of the work is try to establish a global minimum tax to put an end to the race to the bottom. And we are there in that negotiation, which has not been helped by COVID. The last word in the 1 minute remaining would be about what needs to be done. We need to complete that work, but I think also, and you said it in introduction, we need to find a better balance between developed countries and developing economies. The G20 in that sense is a great body, even though it's only the large countries and not the small countries represented. They can be invited, but you have emerging economies, you have the G7 economies, which are the advanced countries, and that was a way for emerging economies to voice the concerns of the developing world. But we need to go a step further. One, because the big emerging economies may not have exactly the same interests as the smallest developing countries, but also because at the time where we are doing debt relief because of COVID, we are fighting, the members are fighting to limit withholding taxes and some tax income revenue for developing countries, which badly needed, because we all agree that domestic resource mobilization is a priority fixed by the UN, and we all want to support it. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pascal, for the great introductory remarks. I think you've given us a great overview, and you've pointed out the common understanding that we have around the challenges, and especially during COVID-19 and the collapse in revenue and fiscal space for developing countries, which is something that the G20 needs to be looking at and is looking at. Let me now move to the Saudi G20 Presidency Finance Track Chief Policy Officer, Mr. Abdel Mohsen Al-Khalaf, to share his reflections and some updates and progress on the tax policy discussions at the G20. Mr. Abdel Mohsen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Osama. I am so happy to join you in this important discussion. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone based on where you are located. So I believe Pascal said it all in a very elegant way, making my job easier in this panel. So I totally agree with what he said, and I will try to leverage and complement the points that he raised. So, as we all know that digitalization led to significant changes in how businesses are operating and creating values. These changes have not yet triggered similar changes in the international tax systems. Companies nowadays can have significant economic ties with a country without the need to have enough physical presence, and hence there is no form to trigger tax rights. This has put traditional the traditional model of taxing company in question, and this also has this trend has also been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, where more traditional businesses are using digital means to sell and engage with different markets. So within this, addressing the issue of tax in the digital economy has been the focus for many years now. In 2013, the G20 approved the base erosion and profit shifting package, which consists of 15 actions and aims to counter corporate tax planning strategy used by multinationals to shift profit from high tax jurisdictions to low tax jurisdictions, ensuring effective taxation of digital companies is in fact one of the actions within the 15 actions in the BEPS package. In 2018, the G20 committed to addressing the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. The work started within the OECD, since they have the technical expertise to develop such work. The G20 OECD inclusive framework delivered a program of work in 2019 to the G20, where the G20 endorsed this program of work, consisting or establishing the two-pillar solution. Pillar one, which is the major response to the digitalization by establishing new taxing rights and profit allocation rules within the work program. And then the pillar two, on the other hand, intend to impose a global minimum tax right to ensure that multinational companies pay a minimum tax wherever they operate, and to end the issue of the race to the bottom, as also mentioned by Pascal. Since then, significant progress has been achieved under the Saudi G20 presidency, started by the outline of the unified approach architecture under Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which was endorsed by the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors in February 2020. And also, as Pascal mentioned, there is a meeting for finance ministers next week, where they will be discussing the reports or the blueprints for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which reflect consensus on many of key policy features and principles of both pillars, and hence will pave the way for a final agreement. This is, I would say, the progress. Let me take this opportunity to highlight that there is no perfect solution to address the issue of tax and digitalization. Any solution would need a form of compromise for it to work. Addressing the issue of tax and digitalization would mean approximately a rewriting of the long-standing 1920s tax rules. This is not easy, especially as it is an inclusive work that requires an agreement by 137 countries within the inclusive framework of the OECD. And any proposed solution is expected to take into account the interests of all member countries and does not materially disadvantage a country over the other. So I would say that nothing happened in taxation on such a scale before. And we need to keep that in mind as we progress in this issue. Finally, let me say that the G20 is very committed to addressing this issue, and the work has advanced significantly under the Saudi G20 presidency. And of course, the work will continue till the commitment is delivered to reach a consensus and global-based solution for addressing the tax challenges of the digital economy. With this, thank you, and back to you, Osama.
Thank you, Abdul Mohsen, for your remarks, and I appreciate your time joining us today. Let me now move the floor to hear from the non-government experts of this panel. I'd like to first begin by sharing that the C20 policy pack has mentioned many of the issues that you just raised, especially issues of automatic exchange of information, and also that civil society actually views international financial and tax systems as a failure to solve the increasing inequality between countries and within countries, which with special impact on gender inequality, which we haven't discussed so far. Civil society, as we all share the worry about digitization, seems to be worried about the digital economy exacerbating the fundamental flaws of the international tax regime if we don't go bold and agree on a big reform. Let me now give the floor to Professor Jayati Ghosh from the International Development Economics Association to introduce her perspective on the subject. Professor Jayati, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here and also to follow on to such excellent presentations that have really laid bare the important issues. I want to highlight the urgency of the matter. I think all of us know that the pandemic has laid bare all of the inequalities in our global economy and also the inability of the governments that control populations of the great majority of the world to find the required resources that they urgently need, not just to deal with the pandemic, but also to deal with all of the other related crises and the climate crisis, which is already upon us. So we really don't have the time. And in that context, the G20 process is definitely welcome. It is absolutely, as has been said, something which is new and is going to take time because it is counteracting more than a century of an earlier tax system, but it is still too slow. Given the urgency and immediacy of the problems, it is not moving fast enough. 2009 was when it was first decided that we need this process. It took another 4 years before the BEPS, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting system, was set up in the OECD rather than in a UN tax committee where it would have been, I believe, more appropriate. But since then, we've had another 7 years with essentially more talk. We have not seen any action in a significant way that would generate the kinds of changes that we need in the tax system. I don't think we can anymore afford not delivering on these critical issues. Now, it's true that the inclusive framework now led by the OECD has 137 countries, but let's admit it, the developing countries are not there on really equal terms. As long as certain very rich and powerful countries prioritize only their national interest, or perhaps not even their national interest, but the interests of their own large companies, it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve the kinds of changes that we need because the compromises are not available, the necessary compromises that have to be made, including by the large companies, just to pay their fair share of tax, pay what other domestic companies pay. Those are not being made available. It's not acceptable, I believe, that during this pandemic, when we see most of humanity suffering so much, many large companies, especially the digital companies, are showing super profits. The economy is intensifying digitalization at this point, and the pandemic has really accentuated this process. Tax systems are far behind. The G20 has to be part of a much stronger momentum to lead to reforms. I do worry that even the G20 is reverting back to business as usual, to changes at the margin, to incremental kinds of moves, which are simply inadequate to deal with the current challenges. So what do we need? First of all, we need new and simple rules that are fit for the 21st century and, of course, for the digital economy. Fundamentally, this requires treating multinationals as unitary businesses. This is how they actually do operate. They don't operate in different countries, they operate globally. We have to recognize this and treat them as unitary. And this cannot be only for a small part of the economy, automated digital services or consumer-facing businesses, as is currently being proposed. Because if you limit it, if you say it's not true for all multinationals, but only certain digital businesses, then that dramatically increases the complexity. It makes it much more possible to keep the current system of transfer pricing in place by most companies. And also it will generate very little revenue because of this arbitrary and irrational distinction that has suddenly been introduced between routine and residual profits. Companies across the world are taxed on their total profits. We can't suddenly make a distinction when it comes to a new global rule between a routine and a residual profit, which are extremely hard to define and will actually allow more tax avoidance. Secondly, we need a much more equal distribution of taxing rights. And that can only be achieved if we shift comprehensively to a formulary appointment. That means apportionment, which basically means that you tax these companies according to countries' shares of global sales revenue or employment or user base in the case of digital companies. And that formula will, of course, benefit developing countries much more because often we have greater shares of users or of employment. But it will actually enable all countries to get much more in terms of taxation than they are getting. And it will require global companies to pay what is effectively being paid by their counterparts who are purely national, who are purely domestic. Third, we need a minimum tax to stop the race to the bottom. The trouble right now is that this minimum tax is being set too low. The proposal is 12.5%, which is conveniently the tax rate of a particular tax haven. We in the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, of which I'm a member, we have been proposing that this should be 25%, which is in fact a normal rate of taxation across most of the world, both developed and developing. If you choose 12.5%, this actually creates not a race to the bottom, but an immediate flattening, because the global minimum will become the global maximum. We need to set a rate that is fair and that meets the same rates that companies pay wherever they are in their national economies. These are three fairly simple changes, but they are dramatic changes. Unfortunately, these changes have been on the table for 7 years, and they are not being agreed to, essentially because large companies are able to lobby their governments to demand various complexities that will render these changes ineffective. I think it's very important for civil society to put adequate pressure on their governments to ensure that it is not just the lobbying power of large companies that can prevent these three critical changes that we need in the global tax system, and that in fact governments recognize that this is a win-win situation for societies, for people, for governments. And a few companies being slightly worse off is actually fine because they have been unexpected beneficiaries of what is already a very, very unequal tax regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jayati, for bringing the perspective of civil society and your expertise on the process. Let me now turn to the UN Unctad for their perspective on the matter. I think we are joined today by Dr. Rashmi Banga, from the senior economist from Unctad. I would like to ask you, where does e-commerce and the digital economy come in play? And how are digital platforms affecting fiscal revenues for developing countries? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Osama, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very exciting panel. Tax might be boring, but I think this panel is very exciting. I totally agree with what Professor Jayati Ghosh has just mentioned about, the importance of tax revenue for the developing countries is much higher than those for the advanced countries, especially in the times of COVID-19. We know that South is going to be hit harder. Economically, it will be hit harder than the advanced countries. And it is because of the inherent weaknesses in the global, hyper-globalized economy, even before the pandemic hit. These are the growing inequalities, the growing concentration of rents, the rising debt levels, and the falling share of labor in total income. And because of these inherent weaknesses, South was already vulnerable when the pandemic hit. And now South is going to take more time to recover. Because if you look at the fiscal space that is needed, the finances that is needed by the developing countries' governments to recover better from the pandemic, there is a lot of difference between what is needed and what is really available to them. And we in UNCTAD, we have our estimates show that the recovery, the global recovery post-pandemic, is going to be a K-shaped recovery, where wealthy will experience a V-shaped recovery, while others will all experience a downslide in their growth. So given all this, in this context, if you look at tax and the importance of taxing the digital economy, I think it is very clear that it is a very urgent matter. We know, like what you mentioned, Chair, that the importance of e-commerce economy and how to tax this digital platforms become a very crucial topic in these times. I heard my co-panelists talk about the inclusive framework, but I totally agree with Professor Jayati Ghosh when she says that the inclusive framework may not be really inclusive in terms of participation from the developing countries. We might say 137 countries is a very respected number, but it leaves out a large parts of the world. Just to give you an example, half of Africa is not a part of inclusive framework. They are not participating in this initiative. Even big countries like Algeria, Ghana, they are not participating in inclusive framework. The other limitations of this inclusive framework is, apart from the limited representation of developing countries, is the capacity constraints of the developing countries which are participating. Also, there is a lack of transparency in the decision making. In February 2020, OECD came out with a publication saying that because of this two pillars solution, there will be $100 billion revenue which can be raised. Now, this looks like a good number because it is around 4% of the global corporate tax income, but it pales in comparison to $600 billion IMF estimates of revenue lost due to tax avoidance. So we have to really see the solutions that are on the table. Are they really going to raise the kind of revenue that is needed by the developing country governments now to recover better from the pandemic? Apart from this, the distributive implications of this $100 billion is also worrisome, because there is a recent paper by South Center which shows that this $100 billion, when distributed among high-income and low and middle-income countries, it is seen that high-income countries will gain marginally more than low and middle-income countries, which proportionately will be losing more from tax avoidance. So I totally agree when Professor Jayati is raising concerns on use of this inclusive framework from OECD by the G20 countries. An alternative, as she suggested, is the UN Committee of experts on international cooperation on tax matters. And G77 has also proposed that this committee should become the intergovernmental body. I think G20 should look closely at the recommendations of this committee. And further, if you look at the digital economy, it is not just the taxes which are being evaded by the digital economy. It is also, they are also escaping the custom duties net. There are a lot of digital products which are now being traded, and the exporters of these digital products, they pay no customs duties. And that is because of the WTO moratorium on electronic transmissions. Now, this moratorium was put in place in 1998 with no understanding of what electronic transmissions are. Now, if we look at the scope of this moratorium, and we say that electronic transmissions include only digitalized products, which means movies, music, video games, software, and printed matter, then UNCTAD paper, this is a research paper 29, I'll share the link in the chat box. This paper shows that developing countries lose $10 billion per annum on custom duties or on only 49 digitalized products. So 49 digitalized products, from them, $10 billion custom tariff revenue is lost by the developing countries. And if this moratorium is removed, developing countries can raise 40 times more tariff revenue than the developed countries. Now, these are very, very conservative estimates. The OECD study recently has increased the scope of the moratorium to include digital services as well. And if we include digital services, the trade coverage of the moratorium increases from $80 billion to $705 billion. And then our estimates, which is a research paper this is a research paper by UNCTAD. And this research paper shows that if with the wider scope of the moratorium, that is $705 billion trade coverage, developing countries will lose $80 billion per annum. So just by removing the moratorium, developing countries can raise $80 billion by tariff revenue. So given that the $100 billion which can be raised by the two-pillar solution does not really seem to be a big amount for developing countries, because again, that $100 billion will be distributed among developed and developing countries. So I think what UNCTAD proposes is that it is important to look at the recommendations given by the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation on Tax Matters. It is also important to look at the multilateral rules and practices which have been put in place, which are severely limiting the policy as well as fiscal space of developing countries, especially at the time when they need this tax and tariff revenues the most. So even the Tax Justice Civil Society has called for G24 proposal to be tabled as a UN General Assembly resolution. So it is important for G20 to also look at these alternatives which can be more inclusive. So I would like to stop here, and then maybe we can discuss more on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashmi. And now I'd like to bring in another civil society perspective from our expert, Toby Riding, the Policy and Advocacy Manager of Tax Justice at Eurodad, which is the European Network on Debt and Development, to talk to us on how she sees and how civil society sees tax justice realized in today's world. Toby, the floor is yours.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. And first of all, thank you for setting this excellent panel up, and also for the kind invitation to participate. I think so many very good and important things have been said already. So indeed, my job has also become much easier. It was mentioned that the COVID-19 crisis has, of course, made this issue even more urgent than it was already, but also that the crisis has the highest impacts on those who were already exposed. Of course, the developing countries, and also the people that were already struggling the most. We also know that there is a strong gender bias in the way that the crisis is impacting, with women often being harder impacted. And this inequality in impact is also something we see in the tax system. When we don't have enough tax resources, basically it means there's not enough money for public services, such as elderly care and care for children, or health care and education. And we see that women are harder impacted when public services are not sufficient. But when we discuss tax, I think it's also important to say that the tax justice community, we're not just saying more tax for everyone. In fact, one of the fears we have is that if we don't manage to get big multinational corporations and wealthy individuals to pay their share of tax, if tax havens still allow these actors to pay less tax than they should, there is a high risk that governments will try to find the tax income somewhere else. And one of the things we saw during the last crisis is that they often revert to regressive types of taxation, such as the value-added tax, which is the tax that you, for example, pay when you go to the supermarket. And these types of regressive taxes also have a harder impact on the poorest in the countries, but also on women. So our fear is basically not only that we won't have enough funding to fight the crisis, but also that there will be different types of taxes put in place that actually will make the situation for the most vulnerable even worse than it is already. And in terms of the global negotiations and the global discussions on this, I think the positive thing to say first is that there is an increasing recognition and perhaps even consensus that the current system is not working and it needs to be replaced. And in fact, when the discussion started about the taxation of the digitalized economy, one of the things we noticed was that there was more interest in looking at taxing multinational corporations at the global level, rather than seeing each multinational corporation as a group of independent subsidiaries and try to tax each subsidiary independently. Because this attempt to try and tax each subsidiary is basically what has allowed corporations to avoid taxation. Also, the minimum tax rate was something that suddenly started getting a very high traction, and we found this extremely exciting. But as previous speakers have also mentioned, unfortunately, we are less excited about the way that the negotiations are going. The first problem we saw in Pillar 1, which is the discussion about replacing the way that we tax multinational corporations completely and replacing the existing transfer pricing system, is that in Pillar 1, the proposal is to maintain the old system for a large part of the economy, and then have a new system that operates on top of that for some profits. So some profits get taxed by a new system and some profits go by the old system. And of course, this means that we're basically, to a large extent, maintaining the problem that we all agreed we were supposed to solve. As Professor Ghosh also mentioned, there's also the risk that the tax system is going to become even more complex than it already is. And complexity is in itself something that can allow corporate tax avoidance. The other problem we saw with both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, in fact, was on the question of where should these taxing rights go? We agree there should be new taxing rights, but which countries should they go to? And there was, and still is, in the negotiations, a big focus on what's called market jurisdiction, which are the jurisdictions where we have users and consumers based. But one problem with that is that especially the least developed countries are not jurisdictions where you find high amounts of users and consumers. What you often see there is you see high amounts of employees, but you also have sectors such as the extractive industries. That is another area that is not is an area where we see a lot of corporate tax avoidance. And so giving priority to these factors when we discuss allocation of taxing rights was something we had hoped, for the simple reason that it would mean that more taxing rights actually are allocated to the developing countries, including the least developed countries. So we find there is a bias in the focus on which countries should have more taxing rights. And on the minimum corporate tax rate, or as we like to say, the minimum effective corporate tax rate, the concern we have with Pillar 2 is exactly the question of whether this system will be effective. It is, as we understand it, trying to learn from a system that already exists in the US and which isn't effective. So there is a question of whether this minimum corporate tax rate will really be the minimum. And in addition to that, I also very much echo the concern that having a minimum corporate tax rate at 12.5% would indeed be a disaster. And we risk that we see a race to the minimum where we actually see corporate tax rates going down. Whereas what we wanted was to raise and stop the race to the bottom. And again, also in Pillar 2, there's also a discussion of which country collects this minimum corporate tax rate income. And again, there is a question of whether the country collecting that tax should be the country where the corporation is headquartered, which is most often in big countries and also very much in OECD countries, or whether we can see the countries where the multinational corporation isn't based, but has operations. Is that where the minimum tax could be collected? And right now we are afraid that we'll see a system that is biased again towards the countries where the headquarters are. So those are some of the concerns that we have with the package that is currently being negotiated. And then indeed also on who is making the decisions, this continues to be a concern, and perhaps also a bit of an explanation as to why we're seeing these biases in the proposals that are being negotiated. Indeed, we don't find that the inclusive framework is inclusive. In order to join, developing countries have to sign up to existing standards that were decided in a process referred to as the BEPS process, where we saw over 100 developing countries not being invited to adopt the BEPS package. And in order to join this inclusive framework, developing countries now have to sign up to this package, which is almost 2,000 pages long. And actually, these rules in the BEPS package are also, again, this old transfer pricing system that we now see more and more agreement on the fact that these rules actually aren't working. And then there's also the concern with the fact that the negotiations are secret. We're not able to see what our governments are actually saying on our behalf in these negotiations. And of course, we also have noticed the fact that the developing countries have, for many years, been calling on the negotiations to take place at the United Nations, where everyone is already at the table. You have a secretariat that represents all the member states, and there is a transparency and a balance that we don't see in the inclusive framework. So this is also something that we find extremely important, is that we believe the global tax rules should be set in the body where we have global climate negotiations, global sustainable development goals and human rights and so forth. It is the United Nations that adopts global rules and frameworks, and it should be the case for tax as well. And the last point is on the way that we use the word transparency, because we often hear that transparency has been increased. But when we talk about transparency, we also talk about the information that citizens get to see. And one of the questions we have is, why are citizens not allowed to know what multinational corporations pay in tax in each country where they operate? And we have, in some places, we have such legislation in place. It's normally referred to as public country-by-country reporting. We, for example, have it for banks in the European Union. And of course, when you get the numbers showing how much tax corporations pay in each country where they operate, you can see that something isn't right. Of course, these numbers show that. And we think this is important information for citizens and for all countries to have access to. So for us, transparency really means that citizens also need more information, and we haven't gotten that from the OECD process. In fact, it was decided already in the BEPS negotiating round that country-by-country reports should be secret to the public. So this is also a concern that we have. And even when it comes to the type of information that is talked about when it says that that transparency has increased, this is the banking secrecy and the automatic information exchange. And also here we're seeing that the OECD countries have received much more information automatically over the last years after the OECD agreements came in place. But we're not seeing a lot of developing countries get access to automatic information exchange. And this is a huge concern because they need that information to collect taxes. So we still have a number of concerns. And in terms of the way ahead, again, the good news is that there is agreement that we need big change. COVID has only turned up the heat on this discussion because we cannot afford to continue to lose hundreds of billions of dollars every year. That's very, very clear. And what we hope is that we can now also start talking about having a process at the United Nations that can also look at all the things that are not currently being discussed in the OECD-led negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby. I think we started the panel agreeing, but then from that moment, we had different perspectives. And at the C20, we really appreciate hosting this diverse panel because we think it's important to look into all the different elements and all the different stakeholders. And now I'd like to bring Pascal back again to share his reflections and give us his thoughts and what the OECD is doing to address these concerns.
Thank you, Osama, and thanks for the speakers. I think it's good we agree on the fundamentals, and it's also good that we disagree because we need watchdogs, we need people to push for the agenda of tax transparency and tax justice. So all the comments are welcome. Of course, I have not to defend what we're doing, but just to bring a touch of optimism because being too negative at some point undermines what's happening and doesn't recognize the fundamentals. It's not the job of the NGOs to play with, the harsh reality of the sovereignty of states, of the realpolitik, which has to come with that. You are more in an ideal world where you can produce recommendations on what the world should look like, but I have to cope with what the world is like, and that's another reality. Maybe two or three remarks, and I'll be quick. One is countries are sovereign from a tax perspective, and I think it's a question also of democracy, consent to tax, and the people of the world have different views, and that's true for small countries, big countries, and I'm not sure that there would be any legitimacy for any international organization to rule out what should be done in the different countries. So that's a reality. It has its constraint because it gives probably too much leverage to small countries, the tax havens, over big countries because they can undermine the sovereignty of big countries. But it also means, and that's a matter of fact, that larger countries have more influence than smaller countries, and international organizations are trying to level the playing field and bring countries on an equal footing, at least a legal equal footing. That's what we do with the inclusive framework. I heard NGO Stove saying, rightfully, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. We've brought countries to the table. And now it's not enough. Sure, never enough. And I agree, tax capacities are not equal. And that's why with the UN, with the IMF, with the World Bank, we work so hard at helping countries to build their capacities. It's something extremely important. But, it's a catch-22 situation. You cannot wait for everybody to have the capacities to move. You need to move before that. The other thing I would like to highlight is international tax is very important. That's my job. I love international tax. And I love that you love international tax. But let's be real. It's not the solution to COVID. It's not the solution to development. It's one little aspect of all that. It's a very important one, but not the only one. So when we talk about domestic resource mobilization, I think we need to think of tax incentives. Tax incentives very often governed by corrupt governments to multinational companies, and you have something really big to do there. And by the way, if Pillar 2 has to have some tax exemptions, some exemptions, it's at the request of a number of developing countries to saying, we want to keep our tax incentives, while another part of developing countries say, please, no exemptions so that we're protected from toxic tax incentives. But there is a lot of work to do there. Better taxing natural resources should be one of the key priorities, and I don't see it on any agenda yet, and I would very much welcome it. Building stronger tax administration protected from corrupt practices is something extremely important, and that's a collective responsibility, including of developing countries. So the first key message would be there is much more for domestic resource mobilization, and I would agree with Tove that the solution is not increasing VAT. There is a real question of progressivity of tax and who should pay for that. The second remark is linked to this concept of sovereignty and gradualism in the approach. I agree that for the big return on companies, the rents, the excess return, there is a need to move now to some form of formula approach, unitary taxation if you want. Do we need to replace the whole system overnight? It's not possible because countries just don't want to do it. And if they don't want to do it, you cannot make it happen. You can advocate it, you can push for that, but you need some form of gradualism, which, by the way, is the position of India as far as I'm aware of it and practice them in our group. Finally, I think, Tove, you're too harsh on guilty. It's not effective. I think it's not true. Guilty is actually more effective than it planned to be because it have many flows and they tax more than they thought they would tax. But you can come up with a much better system, for instance, with jurisdictional blending instead of global blending, and that's our proposal. As regards the rate, it can only be a rate that countries would agree, and that's a constraint. Is there a risk that it would put a pressure downwards? Yes, and you're right to highlight it. I think the promoters of Pillar 2 don't necessarily have it in mind. But today, the race to the bottom goes to 0, and 12.5 would be, if it's an effective rate, much better. Three very quick last remarks. Publicity, I agree, there is a need for more transparency, the country-by-country reporting. Now, in BEPS, the big countries where the multinational companies are said, we don't want CBCR. And they agreed finally to give CBCR if there was some secrecy. Is it the first best? No, it is not. But it's better than tax administrations not having anything. Can you push into that direction? Yes, you should. Automatic exchange of information. We are trying to launch an initiative in Africa and in many other places for the governments to ask for it. Very often, developing countries' government don't ask for having access to the bank information because of corruption. So that's something we would be very keen on supporting, and we are supporting. Finally, who should do it? Everybody should do it. Is it the UN, the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank? We have a platform for collaboration on tax. I was a member of the UN, one of the first members. I mean, when the UN group was renewed in 2004, I was there. I tried to push very hard. I didn't succeed. I went to the OECD and we're just doing. So I will not apologize for having helped cracking down on bank secrecy. It's a matter of fact, having automatic exchange of information. India has received millions of bank accounts. I think that's something which has to be welcome. I will not apologize for having at least started the work of tackling the tax avoidance of multinational companies, whether it's the OECD or elsewhere, and I will certainly not apologize for having brought 161 countries in the Global Forum, 137 in the Inclusive Framework, while spending a lot of money through development agencies to support these tax administrations to address their priorities, which is, I agree, domestic resource mobilization, international tax being only one part of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pascal, for reflecting on the comments today and for welcoming the divergent points of views. Now let's invite Abdul Mohsen to reflect and provide his reflections. I know civil society and everyone's looking forward to the ministerial next week, so if you can give us some insights and what are we expecting next?
Thank you so much, Osama. Let me first comment on two issues. First is inclusiveness, and second is the capacity building. As you know, in 2015, the G20 agreed to create an inclusive body to ensure participation by all countries, particularly developing countries, on an equal footing to the discussion of reforming the international taxation. This is a continued process. There is many efforts to involve all countries in the discussion of international taxation. In 2016, the G20 endorsed the formation of the G20 OECD Inclusive Framework on BEPS. Today, the Inclusive Framework includes 137 countries and jurisdictions. Almost 70% of them are non-G20, non-OECD, and all members participate in the decision-making plenary body of the Inclusive Framework, as well as in all of the technical working groups to monitor and develop all BEPS-related matters, including the work on addressing the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. It is also important to involve the civil society and other stakeholders in this discussion. Therefore, there is usually a public consultation that goes out from the Inclusive Framework. Most recently, the G20 OECD Inclusive Framework on BEPS approved the public consultation documents on the blueprints of the two pillars to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. And these consultation inform the decision or the technical aspects of the work. In addition, it is also important to engage the private sector in these discussions. I believe within the OECD, there is a platform to engage with the private sector on the international taxation discussion on a regular basis. So, of course, there is room for improvement, but the G20 and OECD have taken steps to ensure or to support the inclusiveness of the process, given that many stakeholders are involved and impacted by the international taxation discussion. Second, regarding the capacity building, the G20 has agreed on the importance of tax for development, and indeed adequate tax capacity is important for all countries. Functioning tax systems allow countries to chart their own future, support their spending on essential services such as health and education. So within that, tax capacity is a fundamental development issue, and the ratio of tax to GDP in low-income countries is only half of what it is in some of the developed countries. The capacity building has been as an essential agenda item for the G20, for international organizations such as the IMF, World Bank, OECD, and the United Nations. In 2016, the G20 supported the establishment of the platform for collaboration on tax, which involves different international organizations so that they coordinate their support to countries for the benefit of maximizing the added value to the countries supported. Since then, the impact of its recommendation, the platform's recommendations and initiative has a profound profound added value on building capacity in countries where it is needed the most. Of course, again, I would say on both the capacity building and the inclusiveness, there is room for improvement, but we should also welcome the steps that have been taken so far and advance the work in this area for the benefit of the international community. Let me take this opportunity to highlight that there is a general understanding that the existing international tax system is probably outdated and requires a reform, mainly to address the issue of digitalization. Understandably, it is not an easy task and would require the support of everyone in the process, the governments, civil society, and the private sector. Moreover, we believe the work on the addressing the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy would modernize the work of or the international tax system. Any reform should be inclusive and accommodate or try to accommodate the views and interests of different participants. I would say here a special focus should be paid to the simplifications and to the capacity building for developing countries to ensure that the implementation or what the solution that would be reached provide benefits to developing countries, especially low income countries who could use this or the benefits of this system for their own, to support their own development. So with this, I'll give the floor back to you, Sam.
Thank you, Abdul Mohsen, for your reflections. Now I would like to give the floor back to Professor Jayati. Allow me to give you the floor to reflect on what has been said so far, but also address the following question for your consideration. What do you think is the most urgent message G20 leaders must listen to? The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. And first of all, let me say that I completely understand Pascal Saint-Amé's position that, it is really difficult. We are dealing with a world in which governments come with very stated positions. It's very hard to get compromises. It's very hard to handle. I mean, realpolitik is complicated. I think all of us recognize that. I don't think it's fair to say none of us do it. We're all doing it. Realpolitik in our own countries and everywhere. It's not just the people sitting at global negotiations who are doing the realpolitik. All of us have to face these constraints all the time. Having said that, we also have to remember that national governments that come to these tables don't always necessarily represent national interest in the sense of the real interests of the people concerned. We know that OECD governments themselves are often reflecting the interests of large corporations who are more successful in lobbying and not necessarily looking for solutions that would actually provide more tax revenues that will enable public spending in ways that would benefit the people. So it is very important, I think, since all of us really do want the same thing. I think that is very evident across this meeting. All of us want the same thing. We really need to welcome these demands. I believe anybody handling these negotiations would be welcoming these demands because it adds to the pressure that will actually create some kinds of more progressive solutions. Instead of saying, just be happy at what we're doing, at least we're moving, nobody moved for 50 years, now we're moving, doesn't matter if it's at the speed of a snail because it's movement. No, that's not good enough for anybody because the challenges are so immediate and urgent. But it also doesn't help the negotiators. If you say, well, don't bother us now because we're negotiating, because then the only power in the room is that of the global corporations. And so I think it's very important to actually take this on board and use this in the negotiations, use the fact that there are these obvious, sensible, clear, acceptable demands, which definitely face a political pushback. I also want to comment on a couple of throwaway points. It's not just the small countries that are tax havens, and I'm sure everybody here knows this. Jersey and Guernsey in the United Kingdom, Delaware in the United States, the Netherlands, Ireland. One can go on, right? But the big tax havens, the ones that really are preventing these, are not your little countries in Panama and so on and so forth. It's not these island economies that everybody loves to point fingers at. The big tax havens are the big countries. And they are doing this because they are representing the interests of large corporations who are based there. And we have seen this play out all the time. That in turn means that, in fact, it's very important for everyone to know. So the second throwaway remark, which I must say I objected to, is that automatic exchange of information has to be automatic. Governments don't have to ask for it. We know that the United States government is suppressing information on the tax returns of their president, right? So you cannot have automatic exchange of information, which is dependent on a government asking for it. If we want transparency, we must have transparency, which means this must be data that is released for public knowledge. Otherwise, you will not get the counter pressures. Otherwise, it will always be a nexus between government and large capital that citizens are powerless to confront. So this is something I believe that should not be at the mercy of an international organization. The OECD is an international organization to decide when they will release the information. I believe transparency necessarily requires that it has to be automatic. The final point, what would I like the G20 to come up with? I would like some real movement in terms of actually these three measures related to international corporate taxation, recognizing that this is not the solution for everything, recognizing that this is not even the solution for all resource mobilization. Nonetheless, it is an important element. I would really like G20 to come up with, at least for G20 countries, if they do it, it will be enough to transform the tax system globally. If these G20 countries declare that we will institute a system of unitary taxation based on formulary apportionment with a minimum tax rate of 25%, it doesn't matter what Ireland and the Cayman Islands feel. It will actually transform the tax system. And I think the world is looking to G20 to do something big because they better do. The problems are too intense. We are in a worse than 2009 situation. So this is the time when G20 really has to step up to the plate. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to now invite Tovi to also bring in her perspective. And also would like to pose this question to you. What do you think, from your standpoint, is the most pressing policy reform needed to make the international tax system fit for the 21st century?
All right, thank you so much. I also very much welcome this debate, and indeed, we are happy to help increase the political pressure so that more things can be possible in the negotiations. It's actually one of the points about the transparency of the negotiations is that we can't do our work when we just get invited to public consultations. We need to be able to see what our governments are doing and what they're saying, and we need to be able to target our campaigning and advocacy. So we need the negotiating text. We need to know what's going on, and then we can come and help increase the political ambitions and also put pressure on those who are blocking. At the moment, we are unable to do that because there is so much secrecy surrounding these negotiations. And in terms of the, Pascal mentioned an old slogan of ours, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I thought I would explain that this was the campaign that we had in 2015 when the BEPS package was being negotiated and more than 100 developing countries were excluded from the negotiations. And what we mean by it is that if a country loses taxing rights, it's real money that's lost. This really is about dividing up a pie, as well as, of course, fixing the rules to make sure that the whole pie doesn't disappear into a tax haven. But this is why it's really, really important for countries to be there and represent their interests. And of course, after the BEPS process, you can say that developing countries were invited to come and sit at the table, but a large part of the menu had already been decided, including the focus on which countries should have new taxing rights. There is a stronger focus on market jurisdictions. Still, some developing countries in what's known as the G24 put a proposal forward for the inclusive framework, but one of the concerns we had is that we don't feel that proposal was given enough attention in the negotiations. So when developing countries tried to bring real proposals and put them on the table, we didn't feel that they got the fair treatment that they should have had. I fully agree that we need to make sure we understand that the tax havens are not just small remote islands somewhere in the middle of the oceans. There are a very significant group of OECD countries that are rich and powerful countries. And in fact, I would say these are some of the most dangerous tax havens we have, because they're highly sophisticated and they're highly influential when the global rules are getting set. But on the other hand, we also have a number of OECD countries that are losing out. And one of the interesting things about tax havens is that they often focus on stealing tax income from the other countries in their regions, which is why if we look at, for example, Europe, you have the problem that the countries that are not tax havens in Europe are actually first and foremost losing tax income because of other EU member states. And that's where we need to open up the negotiations, make them transparent and get everyone at the table, because a lot of the countries that are currently excluded are actually also countries that are simply losing out. And there are some European countries that are losing out that have more in common with least developed countries than they do with their European neighbors that are part of the tax haven regime. So we need a progressive alliance of countries that spans across OECD and non-OECD countries to take form. Basically all the countries that are not tax havens, which is luckily still the vast majority. And these countries need to connect and start setting an agenda. We're not seeing this at the moment, unfortunately, and that needs to change. So, and in terms of what the G20 needs to do, well, first of all, clean up your own backyard, make sure your own tax rules are okay, make sure that you are not a tax haven, and make sure that you are sharing information automatically with all countries, including the least developed countries. Make sure that you are not part of the problem. And secondly, G20 asked the OECD to set the global tax rules. We think it's time for the G20 to ask the United Nations to give this a shot and start a much more ambitious negotiation than the one that's currently going on. Thank you again.
Thank you, Toby, so much. Now let's get Dr. Rashmi on board and hear her reflections and final remarks.
Thank you very much. I want to comment respond to one comment that taxes are sovereign rights of the countries. Yes, they are sovereign rights of the countries, but in this digitalized world, we need international tax cooperation. Otherwise, there will be a race to the bottom, and we have seen that happening. So I totally agree, and I totally support the idea of having a global minimum effective corporate tax rate of at least 20 to 25%, like what has been mentioned by Professor Jayati Ghosh as well. I think it's also important to increase the transparency in the system, and in our trade and development report, which was launched last month, we have talked about having there is a need to have a global financial register to record owners of financial assets throughout the world and a guaranteed public access to this register. I think that can really increase the transparency and tackle this issue very effectively. There is also a need to have significant economic presence as the base of international tax norms, and how we deal with how we redesign the global economic governance architecture will play a very important role in terms of increasing the fiscal space of the developing countries, especially at this time of COVID-19. Another thing that is proposed by the Trade and Development Report is, like Professor Ghosh also mentioned, is the idea of bringing the unitary taxation of the entire group and not treating MNEs separately from the subsidiaries, and also having the formula apportionment according to either any criteria based on either total sales, total assets, employment, or it could be a combination of different indicators. And I again support the idea which has been put forward by other panelists as well on looking at UN as because it is more inclusive, it represents all member states, and it is a more transparent process. So this could be an alternative platform which can be seriously looked at now by the developing countries, because like I mentioned earlier, the returns from the two-pillar solution, the returns in terms of tax revenue to developing countries is not going to be so high that they give up so much in return. So developing countries need to really think very carefully in terms of engaging with UN. And there is an updating that is taking place of the UN model double taxation convention. And it is something to look forward. The session is going to take place later this month in the UN. So I think we should all also look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. I think we have around 8 minutes left for the Q&A section. And I know we have a few questions, but we might be able to pose one of them. A question for Pascal is from Mariam. She's asking, to what extent can international organizations such as the OECD set taxation policies before they're perceived to be infringing on sovereign economic decision-making? And she mentioned the current issue with Ireland and BIPs as an example. I know you've talked about sovereignty a lot. Maybe this is a good time to delve deeper into the issue.
Thank you, Osama. Well, that's very simple. Tax is at the core of sovereignty of countries. They have to decide. It's part of consent to tax, so each tax sovereignty decides on its own taxes. It can protect its tax base the way it wants, or it can limit its taxing right the way it wants. What we've seen over a century is that countries have reduced their taxing right with international commitments, which today undermine their ability of taxing. So we're trying to restore better sovereignty by fighting back tax havens or investment hubs or countries which are aggressive in tax competition. But that can be done only to the extent that countries agree on common rule, thus the constraint of trying to come with the least common denominator. That's a difficult exercise. The alternative being that you terminate all your tax treaty, you put your own system, but in a globalized environment, it's pretty difficult to do, even though as part of BEPS, we've recommended countries to be very careful in the tax treaties they would conclude, maybe revisit some tax treaties or put an end to treaty shopping and trying to come up with common rules. But no, international organizations have no legitimacy to impose tax on countries, whatever they are.
Thank you so much, Pascal. I think we might have 5 minutes for quick closing remarks of 1 minute. Abdul Mohsen, if you would like to end with something.
Thank you so much. I would say that reforming the international tax system is a complex endeavor, but there is a willingness from the international community, including the G20, I would say, rather than willingness, a commitment to modernize the international tax system to be in line with the 21st century's needs. And within that, the process started within, I would say, in 2015, and it's a continuous endeavor that will hopefully get resolved or finalized soon. Of course, it's not an easy task and would require the support of all relevant stakeholders, including governments, civil society, and the private sector, to come up with a modernized international tax systems. Within this year, under the Saudi G20 presidency, a significant progress has been made, started with the outline of the unified approach or the architecture. And then we will be discussing next week for the G20 finance ministers meeting the blueprints for the blueprints for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and these will hopefully pave the way for, or will create a solid basis for the future agreement on the global and consensus-based solution. Thank you so much for inviting me. I very much enjoyed the discussion and the insights from the panelists, and look forward to further opportunities to discuss this very important topic with you and the colleagues. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Abdul Mohsen. Professor JAT, in 1 minute, please.
Thank you. This has been a great discussion. I greatly appreciated, especially the comments also from OECD. But I would just like to second what Tove said. I think for the G20, we would really like the G20 member countries to show their own commitment to this process by not being tax havens themselves, and by actually moving this system to the UN tax system, but also emphasizing their own willingness to undertake the kind of unitary taxation of multinationals that would be feasible for them as a group to do as well.
Thank you so much, Professor. Tovi.
Yeah, I think as the last thing, I just wanted to raise a point that one of my colleagues from India raised when someone was telling us that developing countries need to be capacity built and then it's going to work. And she said, we see that these rules are not working in OECD countries either. Multinational corporations are not paying taxes anywhere. So what exactly is the transfer of knowledge that you have that can solve this? And I think this is an important point, is that we need to focus on making sure that developing countries are at the table and that we combat inequality at all levels. But at the moment, everyone is actually losing out. So this is extremely urgent. And warm thanks again for a great debate.
Thank you so much, Toby. Dr. Rashmi.
Well, thank you very much. Like I said, it is a very exciting panel, and I had a very exciting time discussing and learning a lot from the co-panelist. I would like to just say that it is important to look at all the multilateral rules and practices which are restricting the fiscal and policy space of the developing countries. And along with the tax regime, this also includes the tariff regime and the WTO moratorium on electronic transmissions must be removed to give the adequate fiscal space to the developing countries and also the policy space so that they can give level playing field to their domestic players. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashwin. I would like to thank all our panelists today for their on-time remarks and very open discussion and dialogue. I hope, Pascal, do you have a word to close?
Well, just thank you very much. It was not an easy presidency for you with the COVID crisis. It's not an easy year for the world with the COVID crisis. So congratulations for what you've been able to keep in terms of getting ministers talk to each other and keep a momentum. So I would like to thank you for that. And thank you for having organized the panel and looking forward to further development in the week to come and probably in the weeks and months to come as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we hope that you continue this dialogue with civil society next year under the Italian presidency as well. Civil society, G20 and IO discussion is very critical and we're very grateful for everyone's time. Thank you so much. And with this, we're closing the panel.